I want to move on to Dr. Geraci. So Chuck, I think we all know by now, is a coordinator at NIOSH in the Nanotechnology Research Center. He has 35 years of experience as an industrial hygienist. That has included federal government, consulting, and private industry. He directly manages a number of nanotechnology projects in the Institute that focus on the development and dissemination of workplace risk management guidelines, including the document Approaches to Safe Nanotechnology. He sponsors the NIOSH Nanotechnology Field Team that is conducting visits to nanomaterial producers and users to characterize exposures, evaluate controls, and develop best practices. Thanks so much.
Okay, while we're getting my stuff fired up here, one sure way to control the government guy is make him speak last. Okay, so I'm last today. I also have a fatal flaw in my slides. I played around with them last night to make them really cool and spiffy to respond to a lot of stuff I've heard. My fatal flaw is, I can't find them. My fatal flaw is I've got this really nice blue background, so it's not going to keep you awake, so I'll try to keep you awake. And my Sicilian ancestry tells me I can't stand still while I talk. So I wanted to say something profound, and here's my profound statement. I've been going to workshops, seminars, symposia, webinars, you name it, I've been to it for the last 4.5 years, about 97 at last count. This may be number 98. And I kept asking myself, do we get it yet? Do we get it on the connection between all of our various disciplines? Well, this workshop is the first one, I think, maybe not ever, but the first one that's been at least deliberate in my mind that is starting to make the connection in a good, productive way between all of our different disciplines of science. And I'll take a little liberty here. I once worked with a bunch of ethical, legal, societal folks, and I called it a soft science, and they threw me out of the room. So we're all good scientists here, and I think we're starting to get it. So what NIOSH says is, greetings from Cincinnati. We send our best. So this is really a good effort. But so did the Bearcats. You know, we sent our best, too. And so we wish Coach Kelly the very best here at Notre Dame. We're kind of getting used to him wearing these other colors. So we'll root for him. He was great for us. He'll be great for you, except when we play you. We won't root for him. Okay, the NIOSH mission, a quick understanding, It's probably good to get a quick little overview, and I don't want to fall off the steps here. NIOSH, in the Department of Health and Human Services, we're part of the Centers for Disease Control. Our mission is to conduct research and make recommendations. The other O in occupational safety and health, OSHA, in the Department of Labor, their mission is predominantly regulation and enforcement and compliance. NIOSH research, OSHA regulation. So specific to what we're doing here with nanotechnology, nanomaterials research, our mission is to help the industry move forward in a responsible way. And what does responsible mean? For NIOSH, with our mission, it means do it in a way where we understand any possible implications of this evolving technology. And I'll take liberty and call it an evolving technology. And in my mind, it's just the next way we're doing material science. But are there any inherent hazards or risks with this? Can we understand them? And can we develop good guidance so that the technology can move forward in a good, responsible way? And can we also apply this technology to the practice of occupational safety and health? So what I'm going to do for you is give you a quick overview. You've heard a little bit about what NIOSH is. Some update on some significant activities that NIOSH, the little government agency that can, is conducting in nanomaterials research, a summary of some of these results, and also we're going to take a look at the big picture. I'm also going to tell you to strap your running shoes on because I will take a breath, but it'll be the end of my talk. Why the workplace? Why do we concern ourselves with the workplace? Where do you get exposed to anything first? And for me, the workplace starts with the synthesis of the first molecule down to the development of it in proof of concept and scale-up, in full-scale production, where's what Mark is doing, full-scale production. But Mark's product is not the final product because another workplace is that secondary market who will take Mark's product and turn it into 1,000 different products. So we're looking at the workplace as nice little kitschy term back from my corporate days. We look at it from the molecule out to the market and then some, out to the final fate of that material and its reuse, recycle, and disposal. So why the workplace? So that's where the action happens first. And I like to say that the workers are really at the point, regardless of the intended use of the product. So whether you intend your product to be used for A or B, whether it's a drug or a device, whether it's a cleaning product, whether it's a new plastic, there's a worker somewhere involved in handling it and handling the pure form of it, the neat form of that material. Perfumes are benign products, aren't they? Unless you're handling the pure ingredient that goes into that perfume. It's anything but benign. I like to use that example because of, again, my former life at the Procter & Gamble company. We took safety very seriously, and one of the key ingredients was the perfume components that went into all the products. At 0.001% final product, it's a very safe material. Handle that pure material, you handle it as a hazardous chemical. So the workers are at the point. So my focus for what I'm going to talk about, if I'm blocking somebody's view, I will get out of the way. Focus for those of us who practice occupational safety and health is, for the most part, that form of the nanomaterial where there's good potential human interface. We call that exposure. And it's predominantly with the free or the airborne nanoscale particulate matter that we call nanoparticles. So they're not firmly attached to a surface. They're not part of a bigger structure. And yes, I think there must be 800 of us who use this photo. And I think it originally came from Rice. It was actually probably from Richard Smalley's lab, I think. Well, the folks at Rice chastised me for still using it at a conference I did just a couple weeks ago. But we also look at the potential for exposure via inhalation. That's the primary pathway for exposure. But we also concern ourselves with whether or not there's potential for skin absorption or possibly even ingestion. So that's the focus. NIOSH's focus, our predominant exposure pathway that we're concerned about is that of inhalation. So what kind of materials are getting attention? You've heard a lot of them already today. Carbon nanotubes have definitely risen to the top of everybody's interest scale. Originally, it was nano titanium dioxide because that was the first and the easiest one to play with and to show some product applications. Carbon nanotubes quickly took it over, and I think Gunter or somebody called it the poster child of nanotechnology. Well, it really has become that because it's the one material raised as having tremendous, if not unlimited, potential, but it's also the one that people are concerned most about because of a lot of the concern over the toxicology and over the hazards and chemical and physical hazards associated with that particular material. Graphene sheets are actually rising up pretty quickly in some of the work that we're doing in NIOSH. And I do have the fun and the pleasure of sponsoring several field teams that go out and visit facilities, do assessments, do measurements, work with great partners like NanoComp and Mark. We get to see the good, the bad, and the ugly of everything from research out to full-scale production of these materials. And we do it on a voluntary basis. Yes, we're a federal agency, and I think I can stand on some pretty firm ground when I say, hi, we're from NIOSH with the federal government, and we're here to help. I think our field teams really do help because our mission is good, responsible development of the technology in a way that workers are safe. Quantum dots, awful lot of activity, starting a little bit of resurgence with quantum dots. But the high volume materials are the carbon nanotubes. I think we'll see graphene sheets, graphene platelets also move up there, along with the metal oxides. Nano-enabled materials, bio-nano anything has a lot of interest right now in a lot of R&D and scale-up facilities. Bio-NEMs, everybody's looking for that magic biological-based nanomechanical device. But how much information do we know about these materials? What's being published? What's out in the open literature today about that? So I'll borrow a quick little data search that I did out of the Rice University ICON database that looks at all EHS publications from 2001 up to 2009. So if the publication had anything that smacked of health, safety, and environmental data, applications, concerns, it showed up in my search of this database. I also looked at occupational health. What are the articles or the publications that dealt with occupational health? And you can see the little red bar didn't rise very much, and it's still down pretty low at 2009. So the occupational relevant research is definitely lagging. If we're so concerned about the worker being at the point, being the first exposed, being exposed to the greatest concentration of these materials, we certainly don't have a lot of open literature to work on to try to understand it. And then if I look at exposure data, to the point of I can't do a good risk assessment if I don't know what the exposure is. Can I go to the literature and find anything about exposure data? Well, the answer to that is you'll find even less, because if you search on hazard as a class, but then actually look for papers that describe exposure experiences in the workplace, you'll find even less. So there's quite, in fact, probably most of these are, some combination of NIOSH literature and a few other university reports that have been issued. So there's definitely a paucity of data that are out there, which makes our legal community real happy. There's a bias and a basis for concern. I said bias, but there's a basis, and you've heard a lot of these. The real question is, how many of these are still valid when people looked at either the history or the evolution of toxicology data on engineered nanomaterials? Can we say that we're still concerned about the pulmonary fibrosis and granulomas and inflammation? I think that's still a valid concern. But the question about lung cancer, the question about translocation to other organ systems following inhalation, I think those have been explored quite a bit recently, and we're probably going to see a change or a shift in the emphasis on some of these calls to action that people are taking with their research on nanomaterials. But this served 5 years ago as a great call to action and a basis for action out of the occupational and environmental health community. So if you had to organize all the work that you wanted to do, one of the ways to do it is you could follow a pretty basic risk management paradigm of looking at the hazard, exposures, assessing exposures, trying to characterize your risk based on that, and then put together some good risk management programs. And that is, in fact, how the NIOSH research program is organized. We took a look at the risk paradigm and said, what kind of work should we do? How should we do it? And we were very deliberate in our decision to not do it sequentially. We're not going to wait for the toxicology research to tell us what kind of epidemiology and surveillance and what kind of field assessments should we do and what kind of exposure assessments should we then do next. We're doing a lot of this work, in fact, all of this work in a very concurrent basis. My fun job at NIOSH, among many others, is coordinator of a portfolio of projects that make up our Nanotechnology Research Center or program. And we have activity across all of these areas in looking at implications and applications of engineered nanomaterials in our EHS research. So I just want to show you this, that we're not going to talk about every one of these. Each one of these is a half-day talk in and itself. So I just wanted to let you know that our program is quite active. It covers all the things you would expect in a regular risk management approach or the risk assessment, risk management paradigm, but we're not doing it sequentially. We're doing it rather aggressively. So what I want to talk very quickly about, I decided what are some of the highlights out of the hazard piece. Now, are these materials hazard? You've heard an awful lot in the last couple days on the toxicology of engineered nanomaterials. I'm going to add a little bit more right out of the NIOSH book on what do we know and what are we doing, what are our priorities specific to workplace exposure and hazard assessment. So we're doing an awful lot of work on these classes of materials you see here on the slides. Our exposure pathway that we're investigating is predominantly the exposure pathway. So we're doing an inhalation exposure pathway. So we're doing quite a bit of pulmonary toxicology. We're looking at a variety of biological endpoints, predominantly the pulmonary and cardiovascular endpoints, though we do have some work going on and looking at central nervous system endpoints and a little bit with dermal toxicology, trying to answer the question, does dermal exposure represent some type of hazard and some type of risk in the workplace? We're also developing some in vitro screening techniques to do the same thing that everybody else is looking for a more efficient and faster way to screen materials and identify those that are good candidates for further study. So in our nanotoxicology findings, most recently we've published, just as of a couple months ago, some findings on pulmonary exposures, results from pulmonary exposures. Carbon nanotubes causing rapid and persistent fibrosis in mice. Now, we have various classes of carbon nanotubes, single-walled tubes, multi-walled tubes. The fibrosis seems to be a common response across a variety of classes. Are they all the same? Do they persist the same? Do they resolve in different ways? Yes, no, and yes. Not all nanomaterials are going to behave and act the same, but we're starting to see some consistent responses from general classes of materials. Certain nanoparticles cause cardiovascular dysfunction. This was a bit of a surprise to see that there's either some signaling happening or not some translocation, but some signaling that might be happening in looking at cardiovascular changes following exposure to nano titanium dioxide and some other metal oxides and some single-walled carbon nanotubes. I'll also say that before I blur you all over with a little too much information a little too quickly, there's some NIOSH materials out in the poster room, one of which is either a little business card looking thing or a little mini CD. Either of those two bring you to the NIOSH website that is our topic page on our nanotechnology research program. Any of this information is available there. There's also a really cool little button that our IT guys put together for me that allows you to just hit it, and it will do a search of all the NIOSH published literature on nano anything, and you'll see the full bibliography, and you can pick and choose what you'd like to see and search and read. So you don't have to make a lot of quick notes about, well, where was that paper on the cardiovascular dysfunction? You can find it on the NIOSH website, or if it's not available there as a full publication, at least a citation to it. Keep going on here. Some of our other key findings, most recently published by Dr. Del Porter out of our Morgantown Research Laboratory, that following both pharyngeal aspiration and inhalation of an aerosol, that multiwalled carbon nanotubes, certain types of multiwalled carbon nanotubes, the longer, thicker multiwalled nanotubes, show the ability to penetrate or migrate from the alveolar spaces of the lung out into the pleural cavity or the pleural sac around the lung. Okay, that's a significant finding because people said that, well, we need to find out if this particular high aspect ratio, durable, fiber-like material behaves like other high aspect ratio, durable, fiber-like particles. Well, it looks like multiwalled carbon nanotubes do that. The question is, what's the biologic significance of that? If they migrate out into the pleural space, do they do other things out there like other fiber materials do? Asbestos being the one most heavily studied and the one that people most recognize as being studied for this effect. This is one of those, I heard it yesterday, this is one of those scenarios where the researchers now say this justifies further research. Well, in this case, it really does. If there's a 5-step process to answer the question, does any material result in the same health endpoint as asbestos or other particles or fibers that we've studied, this is probably step number 2. So we've taken step number 1, we've taken step number 2, now we have to take the rest of the steps to try to answer the question. Toxicology issues, one of the things that comes to mind about, so what are the things that you'd like to fix or that you believe are of concern about NIOSH studies? Well, they're all less than 90-day studies. NIOSH is in the business of doing acute toxicology testing. We don't do the very long-term, multi-year studies. We're not set up to do it. We don't have the funding to do it. The National Toxicology Program has that as their mission. So we do a lot of screening assays, both in vivo and in vitro, to try to answer a lot of questions. We've got limited capacity. You know, I wouldn't be a good government agency person, research institute person, if I didn't say we don't have enough funding and enough people. Well, we're actually funded pretty well as far as the nanotechnology program. We probably couldn't do a lot more than we're already doing, but we do have limited capacity. As we learn more, we get asked to do more, and we're doing a lot with that. Technical issues around aerosol generation. I think it's pretty safe to say that the most representative way to do an exposure study for inhalation is to generate an aerosol. Over the last 3 years, our toxicology and our aerosol research groups have combined their efforts to learn how to generate well-characterized aerosols of engineered nanomaterials, specifically the carbon nanotubes. That was probably the most challenging. So we're now a repository and also the visitor center for people from around the world who want to come learn how to generate aerosols of engineered nanomaterials, especially carbon nanotubes. And then a selection of which material do you study. The number of nanomaterials that are being researched today is fairly limitless, but the number that will actually end up being commercialized and being out in commerce is one that we try to track and use to prioritize our research and what we're doing. Now we look at hazard and risk. We're looking at hazard determination and toxicology exposure. That's the next thing we need to find out about. Is there actual exposure happening in the workplace? What's it look like? How can we understand it? So that's the next step in our risk management model. Told you we were going to go fast. Exposure scenarios that NIOSH, and I said I have the fun of sponsoring and also accompanying in some cases our field team as we've gotten to in studies and investigations. And for a long time, this was everybody's vision of nanotechnology. Yes, it's this is actually a class 10 clean room. And we've done a variety of laboratories and places as a standard field visit, field investigation. Show us what you're doing. We'll take measurements. Do you have materials? Do you think you have situations where you have an actual worker exposure or a release from your process? How could we measure it? How could we tell you where they are? How could we evaluate it? So we've been in the classic clean room. We've been in a variety of other places too. This is not a pharmaceutical production facility. This is a nanometal oxide production facility. They do rather high volume. This is a rather large industrial-sized pharmaceutical-grade V blender that's been converted to blend engineered nanomaterials. Yes, we were at this facility shortly after we were at this facility. These are all engineered nanomaterial facilities or scenarios that we've evaluated and looked at. And so if your perception of nanotechnology is the electron microscope, it's a bit beyond that, especially in the high-volume production arena that's occurring right now. So we've done a variety of scenarios. We never want to forget the people who do the maintenance on the ventilation system. In fact, that's exactly what this was at one facility we visited. Some flexible designs that we've recommended and evaluated for people to do controls for their processes and their facilities. But throughout all of it, there's this ever-present, hi, I'm from NIOSH and I'm here to help you person. And it really is. It has been probably one of our most rewarding and most successful ventures in the whole nanotechnology arena. The ability to get out and partner with companies, universities, government agencies, who are working with, on one scale or another, the engineered nanomaterials, and work with them to understand their processes, look for places where they have an opportunity for control. It's a nice way of saying, we found your materials escaping out into the workplace, you need to put some controls in place. But opportunities for control, and for us, a learning process on how do you continue to evaluate it better, more quantitatively, more characteristically. So we also looked at recently some true exposure potentials, carbon nanotubes being a hot commodity in the market these days. This is the business end of a vapor deposition furnace where they were making, this is a boutique carbon nanotube maker. I say boutique because if they make a kilogram a month, that's a bunch. But that's a lot as far as the volume of the material. You can see this high-tech carbon nanotube removal device available at Walmart probably for about 98 cents. I don't want to make light of this. These folks are living on thin margins, and they're doing the best they can. The most encouraging thing I can say about a lot of the smaller entrepreneurial companies that we have visited, they are eager to learn the right way to do things. So that's good news. They are very responsible. They understand that the health, safety, and environmental is important. So I'll give credit to wherever they went to school. But then we'll scold them a little bit for not following those same practices in their little startup company. So we've got a metal oxide vapor deposition reactor. Yes, that is bulk multi-walled carbon nanotube being weighed on an open pan on a top-loading balance. They now have an enclosure around that particular balance. And so there's a variety of scenarios that our NIOSH field team has seen, and we continue to visit facilities, and we want to do more and learn more. Since we're on an academic research campus, I've put in red our experiences at research laboratories. This is a quick little snippet from some of our field studies. And some of the metrics that we've used range all the way from collecting information on the morphology and the actual size of the particle, on a mass basis, what kind of a potential exposure has occurred or could have occurred based on our measurements. We collect a variety of other metrics too, size distribution. Every now and then we'll drag out the huge multi-million-dollar inventory of equipment, maybe not multi-million-dollar, but quite expensive. But it's not every site visit. We're very keen on readily available technology that the company or the site we visit can use and duplicate after we're gone. So we recently published a summary of our first 12 of 27 site visits in the March issue of the Journal of Occupational and Environmental Hygiene. And it does two things. It gives a description of the exposure assessment or emission and exposure assessment process that we use, and we wrote it in a way that you or anybody could pick it up, and with enough training and enough encouragement and enough guidance from your local health, safety, and environmental professional, and I think you've got one on campus here, you could do this assessment technique. Then we have a summary of results from 12 of those site visits that we've done to give you some guidance on where were the emissions generated, what was the magnitude of those emissions, and what metric did you use to try to understand if you had some exposure. One of our other researchers will soon be publishing a very detailed investigation done at one facility, a high-volume carbon nanofiber production facility, looking at a variety of chemical contaminants and metrics, in addition to the nanotubes and fibers, PAHs, metals, gases, physical, and a variety of other metrics that were used to do a full characterization of that process. Okay, now we're going to look at risk. If we look at risk, and of course risk is hazard times exposure. So some people would say, well, if we're not yet sure what about the hazard, let's just work on controlling exposure. Good thought. We'll get to that in a minute. First, we want to look at risk. If we have information on some materials and we're able to use some of our quantitative risk assessment models, how would we net out with any of these materials? Well, we've worked for about the last 2, but it seems like 10 years on a quantitative risk assessment for titanium dioxide, looking at data that were available for both the larger or the pigment grade titanium dioxide, but also the nanometer size titanium dioxide. And this particular document is, I say it's going to be released the spring of 2010. That means in government speak any day now, folks. This document has been up on NIOSH's website for the last 2 years for public review and comment. And yes, we got voluminous public review comments on this document. But we're ready to release it now, pending final review by our Institute Director's office. And the key message that's coming out of this risk assessment is that the occupational exposure limit, or the guidelines that you've used for all these years for the large form of a material, may not always be appropriate or protective for the nanometer form. Is that going to net out or be true for every single nanomaterial? Probably not. This one happened to be the one we started with because there was the greatest amount of data available, greatest amount of information on exposure and toxicology, and we went through a variety of models on risk assessment, on the quantitative risk assessment, to come up with this recommendation of a 0.2 milligram per cubic meter 8-hour time-weighted exposure for the ultrafine titanium dioxide. And what does that mean to all of us? What it really means here is that it's a smaller number, a more conservative number than what's been in place for the larger form of that material. And the key takeaway message is, don't always rely on the history or the guidance that's been given on the large form of a material to say it's protective for the nanometer form. We're going through that same exercise right now with carbon nanotubes. And I say carbon nanotubes generically as a broad class, recognizing that there are the single-walled tubes and the multi-walled tubes. There's the purified and the unpurified. But we're working through that because of some of the evidence that's been published in the literature. And one of the key messages that we want to give to people is that the occupational exposure limit for a large form of carbon that's been used fairly commonly to describe how you should handle carbon nanotubes, namely the exposure limit for graphite, is probably not a good guidance to use based on the hazard information we're seeing for the carbon nanotubes. So what this has done is it's spurred a project inside of NIOSH to develop a document that we call a current intelligence bulletin. And it's what it says. What's our current knowledge of the hazard, the risk, the exposure of this class of materials called carbon nanotubes? We're going to attempt, data allowing, a risk assessment of this class of materials. Can't tell you exactly where that part of this project is, but we do want to get information out on the carbon nanotubes as quickly as we can. One of the other responses that we've seen around the world is that a couple different industries or companies are publishing their own internal exposure limit for carbon nanotubes based on the same thinking and the same activity. The European Union is about to release information on their assessment of carbon nanotubes as well. So everybody's paying a lot of attention to carbon nanotubes, so NIOSH is not the only agency doing this. And so then we look at controls. Well, if we're not sure about hazard, one of the ways we can control risk is eliminate exposure. So is that a bad way to go? Probably not. We've done an awful lot of work at what works well with exposure. So I'll start with laboratory scale exposures. We've done quite a bit of work with some research organizations around the country on a variety of different control devices. Now, you don't see your standard everyday Class A bypass laboratory fume hood in here, do you? Well, fume hoods are used quite a bit, and there is a place for the laboratory fume hood. But does anybody know the standard protocol for how you dispense highly dispersed dry powder carbon nanotubes in your laboratory fume hood? You ever tried it?
I don't count.
The PIs get told, sure, we work with it in the fume hood. What the researcher, what the postdoc or your grad student does is they take the carbon nanotube container over to the fume hood, they turn the fume hood off, they dispense their carbon nanotubes, they close the carbon nanotube container, then they turn the lab fume hood on. Why? The Carbon nanotubes are almost neutrally buoyant. They'll jump right out of the vessel if they have any kind of a pressure differential over the top of the container. Laboratory fume hoods are very appropriate, very, very excellent for wet chemistry methods, for many of the metal oxide reactions that are happening, for a lot of colloidal suspensions. So it's really a great device. I say great because it's the one device we all trust in our laboratory research. But in some cases, it may not be the most appropriate device for some of our engineered nanomaterials. And we've been looking at and demonstrating the utility, of a number of these different devices, especially the lower flow, less turbulent devices that are very popular or have been very popular for pharmaceutical folks in dispensing dry powder formulas. I think they're called anything from vented balanced safety enclosures to low flow laminar flow enclosures. But the whole idea is a little gentler flow, but still good containment. We've also looked at and worked with several laboratories on the use of some of the flexible glove containers and some of the more flexible. And when I say flexible, what I want you to say to your facilities engineers is less expensive. Some of the flexible containment devices that are available that are very project friendly and very flexible. We have been working with a number of companies looking at very conventional, you can't see the sheeting all the way across here, but if you've done any kind of work in the industrial world, you'd recognize these as a welding curtain, and that's exactly what it is. But it's also a very effective air pressure barrier, and this particular technician, in his head-to-toe Tyvek suit and powered air purifying respirator and gloves, is blending rather large batches of multi-walled carbon nanotube into another proprietary dry master batch, which they then put in drums and send off to the next person who turns it into sheets of plastic. This particular enclosure turned out to be very effective because whether it was particle counts or air samples looking for multi-walled carbon nanotubes, we really didn't detect anything outside of the enclosure until one of his friends came in and pulled a dirty container out of the enclosure, and it was covered with the carbon nanotubes. So a lot of it has to do with engineering controls, and the other part of it is good work practices. So as you go about your research plan, good work practices along with good operating control hardware are the two good pieces of that puzzle. We've also undertaken a project. We're collaborating with, I call this future work, but it's really underway right now. I've been asked, I don't know how many times in the last couple of years, is NIOSH going to develop some guidances or some best practices, though there really aren't best practices, there are a lot of good practices, on handling engineered nanomaterials in research laboratories? And I usually respond with, do you have a chemical hygiene plan? How do you handle new chemical entities today? What's different, or what makes you think there's something different about your engineered nanomaterial? And so we go through that exercise, and we find out there are a lot of things that are in place that you need to evaluate and revisit to apply to your engineered nanomaterials. So we've got some what I call future work that's needed now in working with some groups of universities to collect good practices and disseminate those to all of the research community. And so we are looking for partners to help out with that work. Collaboration. If nothing else, NIOSH is a good collaborative organization. That didn't sound right. I shouldn't have said it that way. Among many other things, NIOSH is a good collaborating organization. We collaborate in our work on nanomaterials around the world with each one of these organizations. So we have good ties to what's happening in the health, safety, and environment research community around the world. And so we have the advantage of being able to use and interface with these organizations, but also take and give to these organizations and be a part of the global discussion on, are we doing the right science, are we doing relevant science, and will it help our policy and decision makers as they formulate regulations? So one of the things maybe we need to do is do some more collaboration here. Okay, we gave you Brian Kelly, so maybe you can give us some good practices on handling engineered nanomaterials. But we're always looking for good collaboration, good collaborative partners on how to help the technology move forward. If the workers are safe, the technology can move forward, the products go to market. Now, one of the things that I really promote and push is our key guidance document called Approaches to Safe Nanotechnology. It's on the little CD that's out on the table. This has been an evolutionary document. It has evolved over the last 5 years in 3 different phases. The current version is on our NIOSH website. It is not the answer to all questions, but it lays down the thought logic behind a good risk-based approach to handling your engineered nanomaterials and helping your technology move forward. So we call it our starting point for building a good, responsible program. We use a lot of what we learn in our field studies in the updates of this document. We also refer to this document in a lot of our other work. This is also the most heavily cited document around the world when it comes to how you develop a risk management framework for engineered nanomaterials. The OECD cites this as the starting point for their framework. 2 different working groups in ISO Technical Committee 229 have used this. It's served as the starting point for Japan's program. Safe Work Australia has adopted this document and converted it to their framework for their work. So we're real happy about this particular piece of work. The other thing that we're doing is we're trying to do some global collaboration through Rice University and the International Council, or International Consortium on Nanotechnology, through a product we call the Good Nano Guide. This is a wiki-based tool that we're developing. It's ending its first year of its beta version. It is, as it says, a Good Nano Guide. It's a wiki where you can go look for practices, or if you register to be an expert user, you can provide and share your practices. The practices range from laboratory handling of materials to testing protocols to handling bulk materials as you're ready to produce 5 kilograms per hour. So I invite all of you who are interested in how do I do good handling of my materials to see what's on the Good Nano Guide, goodnanoguide.org. Register as a basic, intermediate, or advanced user. We do have a managing board. I'm on the managing board for this. NIOSH is a sponsor of this site. So to be an advanced user and contribute, you have to pass muster with the advisory committee. We actually ask each other, do you know this person? Do they know what they're doing? And then we invite you to contribute to the wiki. It is, I'd call it a refereed wiki, but it's open and it's available for any and all of you to evaluate. We're hoping that over the next 6 months or so, we'll have enough content built up so that we'll be able to say we're now out of beta version. We are going to a more advanced version of it also. So this is a part of our global outreach, is to be a sponsor for a tool for people to share their practices on the good handling of engineered nanomaterials. So the good news with all this is we as occupational safety and health people have a long history of working in the gray zone or having to deal with soft law or trying to go forward when there isn't that definitive quantitative guidance. So working with engineered nanomaterials and all the questions isn't new to some of us. There are a lot of solutions, and so the good news is there are a lot of solutions that do exist and can be reapplied. We know our way around ultrafine particulate at NIOSH. We're reapplying a lot of that to engineered nanomaterials. Collaboration is actually working. I have been practicing occupational health and safety for 35 years. After I got my doctorate in synthetic organic chemistry, I saw the light and got into health and safety. This is the first time ever that everybody is at the table up front of a material or a technology, for the most part, being released out into the marketplace, asking the same questions, looking for the same answers, and collaborating with each other. So I'm very encouraged about the future of the nanomaterials market because we're all at the table, labor, industry, government, academia, asking a lot of the same questions, looking for answers to those same questions. Existing frameworks, I've already talked about, risk management frameworks. What this reapplication of what we already know allows is it allows us to focus on any of those situations that might truly be unique or different about engineered nanomaterials. So instead of putting all of your energy and resources into the broad spectrum of all the questions, focus on those that are unique and different because we know answers to a lot of the others. And then creative approaches are being explored. Some of you may be familiar with this qualitative risk management approach called control banding. NIOSH is exploring its utility as another tool to manage your engineered nanomaterials. So my key message is we know how to do a lot of this already. What we need to do is convince ourselves with that, build our comfort level, and get good expert guidance where it's needed, and NIOSH is a great place to get that good expert guidance. So the quick summary is we've got a lot of products who claim to be nano-enabled already on the market. Many of these are nano silver or nano titanium dioxide-based products. This doesn't mean that there are thousands of engineered nanomaterials on the market. It does mean, though, that there are thousands being evaluated to move on to the market. We know that there are certain hazards associated with these materials. There's an awful lot of research going on, but on the flip side of that, there's an awful lot of guidance that's being developed. And so NIOSH is very aggressive and active in all of these areas. And so it makes for a nice picture that we're up front of the technology, we're looking at all the hazard data, but we're also developing some good guidance. And one of the activities I've already mentioned is the development of our current intelligence bulletin on carbon nanotubes. But we're also looking at what's the feasibility and utility of developing some type of an epidemiologic framework for tracking workers as we go forward. So with that, I thank you for staying, and now I think we move into our discussion.